Hello, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. My name is Shitas Chaudhry. I'm in the group with Winson, Steve, Arif, and Lenti, and we're presenting on Rangers Creek Brewing and Distilling. So let's look at the critical issue. How should Rangers Creek Brewing and Distilling address their lack of capacity? So here are some critical facts for you guys. Currently, Rangers Creek and Brewing Distilling has two types of alcohol, beers and Texas bourbon whiskey. Texas makes for 4% of the entire US whiskey sales. Texas is also a very promising market for whiskey and has an ideal climate for making whiskey maturation, which in comparison to Kentucky, where it takes 6 years, in Texas, it can happen only in a year. There's obviously opportunity also to create a dominant beer market reputation, as there isn't a clear leader in the industry as of right now. We know that the largest share is Samuel Adams, with less than 1% of the industry beer sales. This increasing demand is also raising a lot of operational concerns. And Rangers Creek Brewing and Distilling has about 7,500 square foot facility to work with, of which 6,000 square feet is actually dedicated for brewing equipment, and 1,000 is dedicated for tours and tastings for marketing purposes. A lot of competition with microbreweries and pubs have grown with time, and the US law states that there should be a 3-tiered system that must be followed, which is that a manufacturer can sell directly to a wholesale distributors who can only sell to the retailers who can directly sell to the customers. Mind you, there is no direct link between customers and the manufacturer. All right, so the craft brewer segment actually has been growing at a very high rate. In 2012, we saw that it grew to 15%. Off-premises consumption, which means taking it home or buying from a liquor store, only accounts out of every 4 pints sold, but contributes only half of the sales. So which means that on-premises sales is where we're making most of our sales. Spirits. So 60% of the spirits were sold on premises, while the rest was off-premises consumption. Spirits like whiskey have a significant longer lead times than beers, and the maturation process was as opposed to beer. So as we talked about it earlier about the maturation process, that it basically takes a lot shorter time in Texas than it would anywhere else like Kentucky. Okay. So let's talk about the regulation changes. So first of all, they raised the production limit to 10,000 barrels, and they also allowed a limited self-distribution permit for up to 2,500 barrels per year per license. They also raised the cap for craft brewers to 125,000 barrels per year and raised self-distribution limits. Options sell on-premise only if the brewer's annual production does not exceed 225,000 barrels. They can sell up to 5,000 barrels annual directly to consumers for premises consumptions as well. Texas distillers could now sell their products directly to consumers, when earlier distillers were only permitted through distributors, as we saw earlier in the 3-tiered system that they had. So now I'm going to pass it on to Lenti.
Thank you, Shitas. Hello, everyone. So I will be discussing the analysis part of our project. Ranger Creek executives want to see what operational changes they can make to their company for the years of 2014 to 2019. In order to better understand what possible changes could be made, we went ahead and forecasted the demand for both spirits and beer for the years of 2014 to 2019. This spreadsheet that you see here focuses on the sales of spirits in the US market. All the data shown in this spreadsheet is expressed as quantities of thousands. The information that you see highlighted in blue is information that is already given to us in the case. We went ahead and calculated the Texas sales of spirits during this time period, since they represent 4% of the US sales. This information is shown in the column titled Texas sales 4% of US. Now, in order to predict Texas spirit sales for the years leading to 2019, we went ahead and used the moving average method. The method that we used allowed us to make the predictions that you see here highlighted in green. We used a moving average of 3 years. Now, these predictions that we are making here, even though they are related to Texas sales, will be very useful in predicting what our company sales will be. This table that you see here deals directly with our spirit sales predictions for Ranger Creek. The information that is highlighted in blue is information already given to us in the case. We went ahead and calculated our company's market share for these years. Then we went ahead and calculated the average market share our company had for all of its 3 years in existence, and that ended up being 0.31%. If we were to assume that our company will, on average, command a 0.31% market share of spirit sales in Texas, then we would have the constant growth in cases sold that is displayed in the last column. This constant growth ultimately allowed us to predict what Ranger Creek's spirit sales would be for the years of 2014 to 2019. It is highlighted here in green. All indication leads us to believe that there will be a growth of spirit sales in the future. Now we followed a similar approach to forecast our company's beer sales for the years of 2014 to 2019, but with some slight changes. The information given to us in the case about beer sales is very limited. We only know what our company sold for the years of 2011 to 2013, and we also know what the US craft beer sales were for the years of 2011 to 2012. This information is highlighted in blue on the spreadsheet, but we also know another important factor. We know that the US craft beer segment has been growing at a rate of 15%. If we were to assume that the craft beer segment will continue to grow at this rate, then we would have the projected US craft beer sales shown here in green. For the next part, we followed a very similar approach to the previous forecast of spirits. We went ahead and calculated our company's market share of these sales for the 3 years that they have been in business. Then we took an average of these market shares listed here in the second to last column. If we were to assume that our company will, on average, command a 0.016% market share of craft beer sales in the US, then we would have the constant growth in barrels shown in the last column. This constant growth allowed us to predict what Ranger Creek's beer sales would be for the period of 2014 to 2019, which is highlighted here in yellow. All indications lead us to believe that there will be a growth of sales in the future. Now I'll pass it to Arif, who will further expand our analysis.
Thank you, Lenti. So I'm going to be talking about Rangers Creek's process, and basically what's the process to produce beer and whiskey, how long does it take to produce a certain amount, and how much can we actually produce in a year at our current capacity. Now, first I'm going to be talking about the beer process. So what we do first is buy the malted grains and put them in a machine called mechanical mill. The mechanical mill has a capacity of 180 pounds of grains per hour. Now what the mechanical mill does, it takes the grains and converts them into a liquid form. Then that liquid is transferred to the mash tank by means of a hopper. Now a key thing that you have to remember is that you have to clean each tank prior to anything going into it. So prior to the liquid going into the mash tank was cleaned. Now this cleaning process is going to be the same for anything else that follows it, for all the tanks. So prior to anything going into a tank, it's cleaned for an hour, as you can see on the right side in the graph. Now the mash tank has a capacity of 930 gallons and it's filled to capacity by the mechanical mill. The mash tank takes about 1 hour to complete, and then the transferring from mash tank to boiler kettle takes another hour. Once it's in the boiler kettle that also has a capacity of 930 gallons, it takes 3 hours in order to move on to the next step. After the 3 hours are up in the boiler kettle, it then goes to the first fermentation tank. The fermentation tank has a capacity of 930 gallons as well. Fermentation takes 2 weeks in order to move it to the next step. This is the bottleneck of the process because it takes the longest amount of time in order to complete. Everything else after this is waiting on the fermentation tank. So because of this, the process prior to the fermentation tank repeats until all 5 fermentation tanks are filled. Once that happens and then the 2 weeks are over, then the liquid in the first fermentation tank is transferred to the conditioning tank for the conditioning process. There's only one conditioning tank, and that is because the conditioning process can also be taking place in the fermentation tank. So the other 4 fermentation tanks will undergo the conditioning process after the 2 weeks. Once the additional week of conditioning is done, then it goes to filling and labeling. So for Rangers Creek, we sell all our beer in kegs. With our calculations, we showed that it takes 35.5 days to produce 5,580 gallons of beer. So how did we get those numbers, and what's our yearly production for kegs of beer at our current capacity? So what we did was we took the time that it took for each process to be completed, we added them up and then converted them into days. Then in order to get the amount in gallons, we took the capacity of the fermentation tanks and times it by 6 because there's 5 fermentation tanks and 1 conditioning tank. Then we converted that amount into how many we would produce in a year, and then converted that into how many kegs would be produced. So total, we got 3,701 kegs of beer produced each year. Okay, now moving on to the whiskey process. The whiskey process starts off the same way as the beer process. We buy the malted grains, put them in the mechanical mill. The mechanical mill converts them to liquid again. Then that liquid is transferred by means of a hopper to the whiskey mash tank. Again, you have to keep in mind that you have to clean each tank prior to anything going into it, so it's the same cleaning process as the beer process. The whiskey mash tank has capacity of 930 gallons and is filled to capacity by the mechanical mill, just like the beer process. But the whiskey mash tank process takes 6.5 hours in order to complete. Once completed, it moves on to the bourbon fermentator. Now, the bourbon fermentator takes 3 days in order to move to the next step. The next step is distilling, and the distilling takes place in the bourbon fermentator. There are 2 distilling processes. The first one takes 15 hours, and the second one takes 7 hours. After the first distilling, we lose 705 gallons of liquid. The leftover liquid is known as low wines. The low wines then go through the second distilling process where we lose an additional 25 gallons and then become hearts. So these hearts, the liquid hearts, are then put into barrels and then go on to the next process, which is the maturation. So for maturation, these barrels of hearts are put into either one container or the other, and they stay there for 1 year. This maturation process is the bottleneck because it takes the longest amount of time in order to move on. A full year, you have to wait a full year in order to move to the next step. After the year is over, we lose an additional 30% of the volume due to evaporation. So keeping that in mind, next step is the filling in a bottle. The filling in a bottle takes 79.2 hours. Once that's done, we go to labeling, which takes 4 hours. So after our calculations, we found that it takes 372.82 days to produce 1,590.4 gallons of whiskey. So obviously 372.82 days is more than a year. So to get it exactly down to 1 year, 365 days, we said that it takes 1,557.04 gallons of whiskey to produce in a year. So how did we get those numbers, and what's our yearly production for cases of whiskey at our current capacity? So the same process, we took the amount of time it took for each process we completed, added them up, and then converted them into days and then into years. And then for the amount, what we did was we took the maximum capacity of container 1, the maximum capacity of container 2, added them together, and times it by 70% because we lost 30% to evaporation. Then we converted those numbers into 1 year specifically because it took a little bit over a year. Then in order to calculate into bottles, we had to convert it to milliliters. And then that's how we got 15,717.3 bottles. And then there's 12 bottles in a case. So then converting into case, we got a total number of 1,310 cases of whiskey produced per year. Now, I'm going to be handing it over back to Lenti, who's going to take over the rest of the analysis.
Thank you, Ari. So after determining our current maximum capacity, we went ahead and calculated what the total potential revenue would be if we utilized all of our capacity. We took the prices for kegs of beer and bottles of whiskey given to us in the case, and we determined what the price per gallon of beer and whiskey would be. After this, we used the current capacity for both products that Ari spoke about earlier and determined that the total potential revenue for beer would be $481,130, and the total potential revenue for whiskey would be $40,959. With that being said, now we analyze what the new Texas laws that were passed mean for our company. Out of all the 5 laws that were passed, the 2 laws shown here are the most importance to Ranger Creek. The first law simply states that a brew pub can produce up to 10,000 barrels of beer per year now, and that it can sell up to 2,500 barrels of beer per year directly to customers. The second law states that distilleries can sell their products directly to customers, which they weren't able to do earlier. An important thing to note is that under their current capacity, Ranger Creek cannot produce more than 10,000 barrels of beer per year. As they currently stand, Ranger Creek are considered a brewery/distillery. However, if they want to obtain a brewpub license, then they can definitely do so. If Ranger Creek chooses to obtain their brewpub license, then by doing so, they would eliminate the retailer markup by selling directly to consumers. So after thoroughly analyzing the issues that Ranger Creek face, This is what we recommend that they should do. In the short term, they should focus on getting a brewpub license to further increase their sales, purchase a plate filler and 2 fermentation tanks to further increase their beer production capacity, and also convert 200 square feet of showroom space to container space to further increase their spirit production capacity. In the long term, they should focus on allocating their alcohol production towards Texas pubs rather than wholesalers around the United States, and also consider adding another manufacturing plant. Now I'll pass it to Winson, who will explain the effectiveness of these recommended decisions.
Thank you, Lenty. So now I'm going to be elaborating on the effectiveness of these decisions. So in the very short term, we are trying to become a brew pub. What a brew pub is that they're allowed to manufacture and allowed to sell alcohol. As opposed to before, they were able to manufacture alcohol, but were not able to sell the alcohol as well. So our reason for doing this is so that we can sell directly to our customers. Fortunately for us, we already have outdoor spacing that can seat up to 75 to 100 people. On top of that, we already are producing alcohol. So we have the 2 primary ingredients. So by becoming a brew pub, we're able to sell at a marked up price. If we look at the retailer's price, they are normally selling for $4.50 per pint. When you multiply that by 124, which is the amount of pints in 1 keg, they are making total sales revenue of $558. If we look at the other perspective of us selling to the wholesalers who then sell to retailers, we're only selling a keg for $130. Since our product is such a niche product, we believe we can sell some of the batch directly to our customers, and instead, we could be making $558 per keg instead of $130 per keg. Now, here's a decision that actually increases our total plant capacity. What we are going to do is purchase a plate filter. Plate filters allows us to minimize the amount of time it takes to make 1 batch of beer. The reason for this is because we remove the conditioning step and we save ourselves 7 days from every single batch that we make throughout the entire year. If we're able to make 1 batch faster, what this also means is that we're able to make more total batches per year. This ultimately allows us to increase our capacity for the entire year. If we look under the black where it says beer and the potential units sold, we can see that we are able to sell 3,701 kegs at the moment. However, once we add the plate filter and we're able to make it faster and therefore able to make more, we can sell potential units of 4,611 kegs. This is a 910 keg difference. Also, when it comes to the sales revenue, we're able to make $118,300 more. So this ultimately allows us to get closer to those forecasted demands for beers for 2014 to 2019 season. Not only should we increase the speed of the beer production, we should also aim to make more in each batch. If we look at the current maximum capacity, so before a plate filter, before additional fermentation tanks, we're able to make 5,580 gallons in 35.5 days. What this results in throughout the entire year in beer kegs is 3,701. Now, instantly, once we speed up the process and we bring the amount of time it takes from 35.5 days to 28.5 days, we're able to make a total beer production with that plate filter of 4,611 total beer keg. Now, add the plate filter and also add 2 more fermentation tanks in the beer making process, and suddenly we can increase our batch to 7,440 gallons per batch and still made at that fast rate of 28.5 days. This results in total beer production of 6,147. This allows us to meet the ever-growing forecasted demands for 2014, which is 5,586. So with the additional fermentation tanks and plate filters, we will certainly meet the forecasted demands for the next year. So not only should we improve the beer making side, but we should also improve the whiskey making side. What we are going to do is dedicate 200 square feet of 1,000 feet showroom to additional whiskey barrel containers. If you look back at our process, you can find that for whiskey, it's not about how long it takes for our machines to run. The longest process is the maturing of the whiskey, when the whiskey goes into the barrel for an entire year. This process is very time consuming, so we are limited by the amount of whiskey that we can ultimately hold rather than the amount of whiskey that we can actually make. So with this solution, we're able to take this 200 square feet room and increase the total amount of barrels that we make by 27. This ultimately allows us to make 1,431 more gallons or sell 14,445 more bottles. In total, this will increase our sales revenue by an additional $390,015. So once again, bringing us closer to the 2014 to 2019 forecasted demands. However, with increasing the plate filter, with increasing the fermentation tank, and with this whiskey production, we still need to move to a new facility in the future. We are still in early operations. However, we are going to be limited by our supply, not the demand in the next few years. So if we move on to our long-term vision, what we are trying to do is allocate our capacity and sell more toward Texas pubs or Texas events. The rest of the United States retailers can come second. The reason being is that we're trying to create brand recognition, one that is tied closely together with Texas. So once people think of Texas and whiskey, they can think of Rangers Creek. Other companies already do this. So for example, Tito's Vodka is Austin, Texas's vodka, and now it's one of the top 5 selling vodkas in the world, and it brings together that Texas culture. The University of Texas at Austin is also a school that does this. As you can see in their logo, the biggest part of their logo is Texas, so it's clearly a key phrase to bring in more students. Alice Cowboy also does this, so it brings the reputation of how many Texans used to be cowboys, and therefore portrays a very rugged and tough image for their football team. Now I'm going to pass it on to Steve that will elaborate on the execution and scenario planning of this.
Thank you, Winston. As mentioned before, becoming a brew pub is not impossible, as other microbrewers like Jester King and Hop and Grain have successfully transformed their manufacturing-only plant to now a manufacturing and pub. First, we will apply to become a brew pub and obtain a brew pub license. Now we currently have the legal right to make liquor, but we don't have the right to sell it directly to customers. We should take advantage of the new laws that allow selling directly to customers for on-premise consumption. In our situation, we already have the 2 primary things that make a pub. We have the land, which can fit between 75 to 100 people, as well as the alcohol needed. We will need to allocate some of the beers and whiskey we sell to retailers for these events. For example, if we have 2 events every single weekend for 1 year with 100 people coming each time and each person having 2 pints of beer, this would only be 50 gallons per week or 2,600 gallons of beer, a mere 4.5% of our current annual capacity. Now, spending the $8,000 for the plate filter used in the conditioning step of beer making would change the beer making process. This plate filter should be implemented immediately. It would accelerate the time it takes to produce beer, which would ultimately allow for an increase in production. An increase in production would recover the cost of this plate filter. We will also have to ensure that a schedule is followed to ensure enough raw material such as the raw grain is available when needed to meet our increased demand. The 2 fermentation tanks that we will purchase would be stored in the beer production section. We will take 200 square feet off of the 1,000 square feet of space we already have at the showroom and section it off strictly for storage of the whiskey barrels in shelves. This can be accomplished by using dividers. We will have to ensure there are enough empty 53-gallon barrels for the whiskey. A schedule should be made to ensure that there is enough manpower available to fill the whiskey into bottles after it has finished maturing. Now, in terms of our scenario planning, our fermentation tank maturing process could fail. We would do frequent maintenance to minimize any potential loss in quality. This is the longest process, so if this step breaks down, everything is halted. We must also not be tempted to rush and put boiled wort into the fermentation tank because that should we should allow it to cool off before it enters the fermentation process. We would have to try to eliminate any mistakes in this process. For the whiskey barrels, the flavoring of the oak wood and aromatic compounds come from the barrel, so it is essential we are mindful of the barrels. our forecasting is most likely inaccurate. It's very limited because of insufficient historical data, since this is only our third year of production and only the second year of selling whiskey. As the years progress and the growth becomes more stabilized, there will be more of an accurate depiction of expected sales. We can construct multiple styles of forecast that will be more useful in terms of production quantity that will be needed to meet the expected demand. It is possible that we will have a lack of local demand. Our aspiration is to host events of up to 100 people. So we will need to make sure that our brew pub becomes a popular spot. Proper promotion and use of social media are must. We can also introduce complementary products like the Texas style barbecue to attract customers and get our 100 people that we are expecting to show up. Now that concludes our presentation, and thank you very much for your time.